in Europe and elsewhere in the world, welcome to all of you. We have a good turnout of experts, board members, Madam Managing Director. Whenever we have this many Atlantic Council board members in the room, you know that there's someone important to be heard. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special edition of the Atlantic Council Front Page, our premier platform for global leaders. And today in our headquarters, we have the honor of hosting Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and Managing Director. It's always an honor to have you here. Next week, the world's finance ministers and central bank governors will gather in Washington for the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. These officials will need to contend with a range of complex problems, from lingering inflation to high debt levels and uncertain prospects for China's growth. But it's not just macroeconomics that will be on people's minds. Honorary Director of the Atlantic Council, former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, says that we're facing the biggest threat to the global system since the 1930s, so this is a perilous moment for the world. The war in Ukraine has entered its 26th month. The war between Israel and Hamas in its 6th month, and the war, and we have tensions elsewhere across the world, particularly between the two largest economies, as the IMF has pointed out, fracturing the global economy into rival blocs. Common cause has never been more required, and common cause has been seldom so difficult to come by. In helping countries navigate these challenges, the Managing Director has described the fund as, quote, a steady ship going through choppy waters. The world is fortunate to have a navigator like you, Managing Director. In the 1990s, Ms. Georgieva served at the World Bank, helping post-Soviet economies transition to a new economic model. Then, as Vice President of the European Commission in the 2010s, she responded to the Euro area debt crisis and 2015 refugee crisis. In 2017, she returned to the World Bank as CEO, overseeing major changes within the institution. Then in 2019, just months before the outbreak of COVID, she began her term as Managing Director of the IMF. In 2020, in the teeth of COVID, we presented Ms. Georgieva with the Atlantic Council's highest honor, our Distinguished Leadership Award. And we were just chatting outside, former Secretary of State, the late former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, presented her with the award. It was a very moving moment. The pandemic created both a health and an economic crisis. The IMF sprang into action, delivering immediate financial and developing new finances and developing new lending programs to quickly adapt to the changing needs of its members. The fund used its firepower and made more than $300 billion available to countries in need. But even amid this crisis, Ms. Georgieva kept pushing the fund to think beyond the immediate challenges and prepare for the decade ahead. From climate change to artificial intelligence to digital currencies, she tried to ensure that the IMF would be fit for purpose and fit for the future. This forward-looking ethos is what drives our work at the Geoeconomic Center, where a brilliant team is so capably led by Josh Lipsky. Created 4 years ago at the outbreak of this pandemic, of the pandemic, the team leads on cutting-edge research from China's economy to the role of the dollar to the use of sanctions. They've taken to heart the words of Secretary Yellen, who precisely 2 years ago from this podium spoke and reminded us that the Bretton Woods institutions were not created after the war, but during the war, 6 weeks after the invasion of Normandy. Now, just as then, we must seek to build the future we want, even as we fight for the present. That's the purpose of the Geoeconomic Center's Bretton Woods 2.0 project, dedicated to building a more resilient economic future for decades to come. As the institutions near their 80th anniversary this summer, the geoeconomics team is already thinking ahead to the 100th anniversary. In fact, next week, as part of this project, the Atlantic Council, working in partnership with our 16 programs and centers at the Council, will host 20 finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world here at our headquarters. We're also bringing in lots of extremely good food, which we hope will attract a crowd as well. All of them, Ms. Georgieva, are going to want to know what you're saying today, setting the stage. Your perspective, your preview of the IMF's World Economic Outlook, and your agenda for the upcoming meetings. After the Managing Director's speech, we'll have a chance to dive deeper into some of these issues. But with that, Madam Managing Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred, for this very kind introduction. And my thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting us today. Like the IMF, the Council is an institution grounded in the belief that dialogue and cooperation can build a more prosperous world. We also share some DNA. Secretary Dean Acheson, who co-founded the Atlantic Council, was also present at the Bretton Woods conference that Fred referred to in 1944, which gave birth to the IMF and the World Bank. Reflecting on his years in public service, Acheson later wrote, "The simple truth is that perseverance in good policies is the only avenue for success. In a world of more frequent shocks and heightened uncertainty, we need good policies more than ever. Making the right policy choices will define the future of the world economy. It will define how this decade is remembered. Will it go down in history as the turbulent 20s, a time of disruptance and divergence in economic fortunes, or the tepid 20s, a time of slow growth and popular discontent, or the transformational 20s, a time of rapid technological advancements for the good of humanity?" Well, we will talk about these questions, but before I go there, let me start with where we are today. You will see in our World Economic Outlook next week that global growth is marginally stronger on account of robust activity in the United States and in a number of emerging market economies. Sustained household consumption and business investment and an easing of supply chain problems helped. And inflation is going down. The resilience of the world economy, mostly due to the sound macroeconomic fundamentals, the good policies that Acheson talks about, that we built over the last years. This resilience is helped by strong labor markets and an expanding labor force. The strength of labor supply is partially due to immigration, which has been especially helpful in countries with aging populations. Overall, based on the data, it is tempting to breathe a sign of relief. We have avoided a global recession and a period of stagflation. Some have predicted it. It has not happened. But there are still plenty of things to worry about. The global environment has become more challenging. Geopolitical tensions increase the risk of fragmentation of the world economy. And as we have learned in the past few years, we operate in a world in which we must expect the unexpected. The sobering reality is global economic activity is weak by historical standards. prospects for growth have been slowing since the global financial crisis. Just look at this graph. And inflation is not fully defeated. Fiscal buffers, on the other hand, have been depleted, and debt is up, posing a major challenge to public finances in many countries. The scars of the pandemics are still with us. The global output loss since 2020 is around $3.3 trillion, with the costs disproportionately falling on the most vulnerable countries. And we see a growing divergence within and across country groups. Among advanced economies, the US has experienced the strongest rebound, helped by rising productivity growth. By contrast, activity in the euro area is recovering much more gradually, reflecting the lingering effects of high energy prices and weaker productivity growth. Among emerging market economies, countries like Indonesia and India are faring better, but there are some in vulnerable situation. And what is most striking is divergence for low-income countries, for whom the scarring has been the most severe. Among these nations, fragile and conflict-affected economies are bearing the heaviest burden. Beneath it all, the primary driver of weaker growth is a significant and broad-based slowdown in productivity. Our analysis shows it accounts for over half of the growth slowdown in advanced and emerging economies, and nearly all in low-income countries. As a result, our medium-term outlook for global growth remains well below its historical average. It is just slightly above 3%. Without a course correction, we are indeed heading for the tepid 20s, a sluggish and disappointing decade. And at this junction, policymakers face a choice. They can avoid difficult decisions and try to muddle through with less than good policies. Or they can make another choice. They can follow Acheson's advice and choose good policies, deal decisively with inflation and debt, and promote economic transformation to boost productivity, inclusion, and sustainable growth. What we need is the transformational 20s. But first things first. First, we need to bring back price stability. This is the task of central bankers, many of whom are carefully calibrating this important policy choice: when to cut interest rates and by how much. We have seen what good policies can achieve since inflation peaked in mid-2022. In the final quarter of 2023, headline inflation for advanced economies was 2.3%, down from 9.5% just 18 months earlier. For the median emerging market and developing economy, inflation declined to 4.1%. And we expect this trend to continue in 2024. But let me say, continue with ups and downs, backs and forths. Creating the conditions for major advanced economy central banks to begin cutting rates in the second half of the year. And the pace and timing, we have to be very clear. This monetary pivot would differ from a country to a country. No more we are in the place of the 2020 when everybody went in the same direction. Central banks will have to carefully monitor data. Some have already begun to loosen. These are mostly central banks in emerging markets where inflation was tackled earlier. But elsewhere, primarily in advanced economies, they are still holding off on cutting for now. and they will calibrate what to do based on incoming data. On this final stretch, it is doubly important that central banks uphold their independence. As we know, policy credibility is vital in the fight to restore price stability. Where necessary, policymakers must resist calls for premature interest rate cuts, because premature easing can see new inflation surprises that may even necessitate a further bout of monetary tightening. And we have to recognize, on the other side, delaying too long could pour cold water on economic activity. Let me go to our second priority. Time has come to rebuild fiscal buffers. Over the past couple of years, we at the Fund have been advocating for fiscal policy restraint, primarily to support central banks as they fight inflation. But now, a focus on fiscal policy is warranted on its own right. Why? Because fiscal buffers are exhausted and debt levels in most countries are simply too high. The trend of rising debts actually began more than a decade ago, during a prolonged period of very low interest rates. The pandemic then necessitated an unprecedented fiscal response to protect lives and livelihoods, and then that surged even more. Now we are in an era of far higher interest rates, and this is pushing the cost of servicing debt up. In advanced economies, excluding the United States, interest payments on public debt will average at about 5% of government revenues this year. But the cost of servicing debt is most painful in low-income countries. Their interest payments are set to average about 14% of government revenue, roughly double the level from 15 years ago. For most countries, the prospect of soft landing and strong labor markets mean there is no better time to act, to reach sustainable debt levels and build stronger buffers to cope with the shocks that will come in the future. For some countries, delay is simply not an option. Consolidation must start now to avoid tipping into debt distress. And for a handful of countries already in debt distress, restructuring may be a necessity. And there, the common framework that the G20 put together can help. I want to celebrate with all of you Zambia's achievement. They recently finalized its agreement with the bondholders, complementing the restructuring with official bilateral creditors. So, bravo! But there are more countries that need to get to the same point. Now, we have learned lessons from the debt restructuring processes, and we need to build on these lessons. And I want to stress that this would be a big part of discussions during our spring meetings. We will convene again the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, and our goal this time would be to build further clarity on comparability of treatment among different creditor groups and to establish clear and predictable timelines for debt restructuring. Now, for all countries, rich and poor, fiscal prudence is hard. And this is especially true in a year with a record number of elections and at the time of high anxiety due to exceptional uncertainty and all these years of shocks. In fact, our forecasts show deficits will still be too high to stabilize debt in over 1/3 of advanced and emerging economies and in more than 1/4 of low-income countries. And this is why we are advocating for adopting a credible medium-term fiscal framework as the ultimate good policy choice for countries. And we also recommend more focus on closing tax loopholes, strengthening tax collection, improving the quality of public services. Fiscal strength allows countries to support the most vulnerable parts of their societies and to invest in a better future. And that brings me to the third priority: policies to reinvigorate growth. Lifting up growth prospects is paramount. We know it. Without it, we can't see living standards going up. We can't strengthen economic resilience. What it requires are two things: eliminating constraints to economic activity and creating opportunities to boost productivity growth. Foundational reforms, strengthening governance, cutting red tape, increasing female labor market participation, improving access to capital, they all have a role to play. Across emerging and developing countries, a well-sequenced package of reforms of that nature could lift output by 8% in 4 years. And of course, even more can be achieved with policies to encourage economic transformation, to speed up the green and digital transition. How well we handle them will define the legacy of this decade. And this is particularly important for the green transition. How quickly we advance it will have tremendous significance to whether we succeed to tame climate risks. But the shift to a climate-friendly economy goes beyond managing risks. It also offers tremendous opportunities for investments, for jobs and growth. And we are already witnessing the economic, health, and environmental benefits of transformative investments, including in renewable energy, in electric mobility. I see Jeffrey Okamoto here. Jeffrey, I hope you're still driving your Tesla, or your Tesla is driving you. And in ecosystems restoration. For every $1 spent on fossil fuels, $1.7 now is spent on clean energy. 5 years ago, this ratio was 1:1. But we need robust policies and institutions for a stable and encouraging, predictable investments in climate, also to tackle a range of market failures. I mean, obviously, technological advancements go way beyond what I just listed. They affect many sectors of the economy, from manufacturing to healthcare and financial services. We have been transitioning to a new digital economy, and the pandemic put it on steroids. And now artificial intelligence is likely to dramatically accelerate the fourth industrial revolution. This brings huge potential benefits, but also risks. A recent IMF study shows that artificial intelligence could affect up to 40% of jobs across the world and 60% in advanced economies. It could enhance workers' productivity, but also threatens some jobs. Investing in digital infrastructure and skills, as well as in strong social safety nets, will determine the pace of AI adoption and its impact on productivity. Both the climate and the digital transformation require coordinated global efforts to manage risks and capture the benefits they create. And that takes me to my final point. Cooperation on policies matters to the world. The pandemic, war, geopolitical tensions, they have already changed the playbook for global economic relations. Policymakers are looking to strike a balance between efficiency and security, between cost considerations and resilience of supply chains. There are already signs that trade relations are being reshaped. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trade growth between economies in politically distant blocs has slowed by 2.4 percentage points more than trade among those that are more closely aligned. And as trade flows are rerouted, connector countries may benefit. But supply chains are lengthening with potential costs at every step. And industrial policies are back on the agenda, with new analysis showing more than 2,500 policy interventions worldwide just last year. China, the EU, and US account for almost half of the total. How should we think about these measures? In short, if there is a market failure that needs to be addressed, such as accelerating innovation to address the existential threat of climate change, there is a case for government intervention, including through industrial policy. If there is no market failure, there is a need for caution. The case for government intervention is much weaker. Some of the measures announced or implemented last year were not always clearly related to market failures. Our staff has stepped up work in this area because more data, analysis, and dialogue are needed to avoid costly mistakes. More broadly, we advocate for more trade and cross-border investment flows to increase productivity and address global challenges, and for more attention for how the benefits from trade and investment are shared in society. We must avoid past mistakes when the negative impact of globalization on some community was ignored and led to backlash against an integrated world economy. So let me say a couple of words about us, the IMF. Throughout our history, we have been and we remain a transmission line for good policies and a place for economic cooperation. In a fast-changing and more turbulent world, bringing countries together to tackle challenges and pursue opportunities is more important than it has ever been. When the world has been hit by the pandemic and a cost of living crisis, as Fred said, we acted decisively to help our members. We have also stepped up our efforts to help countries deal with transformational challenges such as climate change and the digital transition, with new analysis, with new partnerships, with new instruments. For example, we now have the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It provides already support to 18 countries. And just as countries build resilience to shocks, so do we at the IMF. Our numbers in terms of financial strength are going up, and rightly so. Our members have supported 50% quarter increase for our permanent lending resources and more capacity to help our poorest members. We have reached our target for our own financial buffer. So when we send to countries, build financial buffers, we do it ourselves. And now we are directing our attention to how better we could use our balance sheet to ensure we are well positioned to help our members. And that is a good place to end. Just as our balance sheet represents the collective financial strength of our members, our spring meetings next week represent our collective commitment to cooperation and international dialogue. So, as we gather in Washington, we have what Acheson described as a fundamental choice between meeting the problems with which the world will be faced through methods of international cooperation, or each nation's relying on its own resources and its own strength and going its own way. Working together is the choice of good policies, the choice that would deliver what we aspire for: growth, jobs, and prosperity for people everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those truly powerful remarks. We have some time now for some questions, and toward the end, I'll turn to the audience for a couple questions as well. Let me quote you. We operate in a world where we must expect the unexpected. It's unusual to have IMF Managing Director talk as much about geopolitics as you do. Because you have to plan, because you have to put together packages, how do you plan for the unexpected? And particularly in this decade where we've had COVID unexpected, you've had an invasion of of Ukraine unexpected.
Please.
Oh, there go the markets. And then, of course, this year, October 7th, Hamas and the ensuing war, terrorist attacks and war. Unexpected. How do you handle that?
Well, the most important lesson I learned through my professional life is that one can build the capacity to anticipate, act early, and target the most vulnerable, those that are most severely affected. At the fund, what we do is we actually periodically think of the unthinkable analysis, come up with a hypothesis of something that looks absurd and impossible, and what are we going to do if the impossible becomes a reality. And that helps. But most importantly, we focus on three things, Fred. One, the quality of our analysis. We bring a global public good as an institution because we are the only ones that are trusted to hold the hand on the pulse of all 190 members, to check their vital signs regularly. And when we aggregate this information, we then turn it for the benefit of our members so they can draw some conclusions, and of course it builds anticipatory posture. So analysis is critical. The quality of this analysis becomes even more important in this world of more frequent shocks. Two, we have to radiate confidence by having the financial strength and the speed of action that is required, so when we act, it passes to the rest of the world a sense of confidence. The fund is there. And we have done a lot over the last years to build this financial strength. I mentioned the quarter increase. We also did a $650 billion SDR allocation to boost reserves and liquidity immediately after COVID. And the third thing is hugely important. It is our staff's ability to quickly shift gear towards what the most immediate priority is. And I can tell you, I cannot be more proud of the staff of the IMF. Let me give you just one example. So the pandemic hits. WHO announces that the world is in big trouble. 1 week after this announcement, we did our first disbursement. It was to the Kyrgyz Republic of emergency financing. And after this first disbursement, very quickly, we came with a massive support for our members. When we got the hit from Russia's invasion, very quickly our membership mobilized to think about the necessity to make some policy changes so the fund can actually help a country like Ukraine. And we did that. We came up with $15 billion support package that mobilizes $120 billion. So to finish on that, obviously, we are an institution that wisely was created to be acting in crisis. And that's what we have been doing. And we constantly build that capacity to anticipate, act early, and I want to repeat, target the most vulnerable of our members and the most vulnerable people in these affected countries.
And do you think this volatility that we're facing is the new normal, the geopolitical?
I think we have to buckle up for more to come, because it is a more diverse world, and it is a world in which we have seen divergence not just in economic fortunes, but also divergence in objectives for role countries play.
Thank you for that. Fragmentation, on the one hand, the need for common cause, on the other hand. You've written and spoken many times in the past year about the risks fragmentation poses to the global economy, including really excellent essay. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading in Foreign Affairs. You've launched models on the risks of geopolitical trade blocs, actually here at the Atlantic Council. So talk about the fragmentation. Do you have tools that can guide us away from protectionism, or is it just the bully pulpit where you have to remind people of the negative consequences? Is that enough?
Well, first, it is important to present rationally and with no bias the cost of policy decisions, and that's what we do. So when it comes down to cost of fragmentation, we run studies on trade, on investment flows. We run studies, as I mentioned in my speech, on what is actually happening and how it impacts countries. Some benefit from the connected countries benefit from what is going on, but overall the consumer is hit with higher prices. So we present that. But that, of course, is not enough. We engage in our so-called Article 4 consultations in more detailed analysis on a country-by-country basis. And then we present policy choices to countries and what the consequences of those choices would be. I think, actually, the most important service we provide is the spring and the annual meetings, bringing everybody together. I think we are undervaluing the format of the meetings, and also the fact that we have the G20 Economic Forum, finance ministers and central bank governors. Because in these conversations, the tone of these conversations, when it is pragmatic, kind of helps to bring the temperature down. And it is where some deviation from really bad directions takes place.
So first of all, we can talk about a positive direction. You've talked about the United States and its economic performance, the fastest growing G7 economy, surpassing most forecasts on the upside in terms of growth, and also in terms of inflation, though inflation seems now to be a little stickier than maybe some people thought. Maybe it was an early celebration. How do you look at the U.S. economic outlook in 2024, particularly from this mixture of questions of growth and inflation? And what is it about the U.S. economy? We saw your very powerful charts that got it through in the form that it did.
Well, let me start with the last part of your question. What is it that makes the U.S. so successful? There are three things. One is the U.S. is more innovative economy, and the fact that it opens up space for entrepreneurship in a way that some other economies don't, really at the time of accelerated technological change, all other things equal, benefits productivity in the U.S. Second, what we have seen in the U.S. is labor markets holding really well. Labor supply boosted by something that is actually quite